just like to provide a little bit of background. A couple of years ago, the large immediate finance committees started an initiative discussing different negotiating strategies, opportunities, and tactics that might be helpful to the industry. And we had, I think, 15 different working groups working on different aspects of negotiating. And across the different groups, an interesting theme started to pop up. And the theme related to what is now referred to as the power of pricing options. That there were strategic advantages and wisdom to providing not one option, but multiple options. So we are very fortunate to have Rick Brook from WPP, who's going to share some of the training and tips and information that he's been discussing with WPP entities for several years now. One of the things I learned early after coming to the 4As was you can come up with your own ideas. What's even better is to steal proven ideas from smart people. So,
which is exactly what I did.
So the 4As has been trying to evolve more discussions on this pricing options approach. We had, and Rick will refer to Tim Williams, who has worked with WPP on some of this. We had Tim do a presentation at our annual conference last year, and it was extremely well received. I really think this is a very exciting approach for a couple of reasons. One, it's within our control. Two, the members who I've talked to over the last 6 to 9 months who have been trying to evolve using pricing options and learn how to do it and do it more consistently keep coming back with one mantra. It changes the discussion you have. So Professor Brook has really got some excellent content. And without further ado, I think you all know Rick. For some of the folks for the Jade Forum, nice to have you with us today.
Why are they in the cheap seats? You guys can move forward if you want.
That's right.
It's like Tom says, no, do not interact with the big agency people. They're awful.
He's a big guy, but he doesn't. Just in terms of, Rick heads up the commercial practices group of WPP. He's been an active member of our large agency finance committee for a number of years, and in fact, is the former chair. So he's quite knowledgeable, as you will soon know. Take it away.
So thanks, Tom. I'm actually still trying to figure out why I'm up here standing here with this presentation, but here I am. I've got a mic on. Hopefully you can hear me. Apparently that's because I'm being videotaped. So Tom says, "Oh yeah, no, we're going to videotape this." The only thing I can imagine is that Tom's trying to create his own sort of set of home movies that he's going to bring home and show his family. I just feel so bad for that family. Here's what we're going to do today. I really have two different topics that I'm going to cover off on, all related to pricing. The first, I'm going to talk to you for about 20 minutes about pricing as a discipline and the challenges that we face in the industry. Then we're going to actually talk about some practices for pricing. And when we start talking about the practices, we're gonna have you do a bit of work, and don't run away. Oop, Sal's locked the door. So we're gonna do a little bit of work, and the reason why I'm gonna do that is I'm hoping that through this second section that you will learn enough about what we do when we train some of these concepts that you can also start training some of your own people. There's a folder that Tom's handed out. It's the blue one, right, Tom?
Yeah, that's correct.
There are some worksheets in there. If you get bored with what I'm saying, you can start looking ahead. No, there's no secrets in there. But what we'll do as we get into the section the session a little bit later this afternoon is we're going to have you do a little bit of work just so you get a sense of what it's like. We'll probably do it quicker than I would normally do in one of these sessions in our agencies. But the idea is for you to get a sense of what you might be looking for a group to do as you're putting some of this training together. So think of yourself as seeing some of this information for the first time, but also think about how you might use this to train your own companies and to train your own organizations so that you can evolve things a little bit. First of all, the reason why we're talking about pricing is ultimately pricing is everything. The reality is that if you don't focus on pricing, if you don't create a good pricing strategy and ultimately propose a good set of prices for the work you're about to do, it doesn't matter how clever you are. It doesn't matter how well you think you can manage utilization of people. It doesn't matter how well you manage the seniority mix of your staff. If the deal is wrong to begin with, you can drive yourself crazy for months and years trying to turn that into a profitable deal. So we would always say that pricing is key. You have to start there, and if you don't get that right, then really is in some ways all is lost. We bring this up because frankly too many of the things that we do, certainly within the agencies that I have responsibility for, but I think also across the industry, because I've worked in a few of the different holding companies, we tend to have a habit of creating deals that don't keep us in good stead for the long run. And here are a few of the things that happen in our deals. First of all, I can go to any agency today and find out that they are billing the client using hourly rates that are 3 years old or longer. In fact, we came across something recently where we've not managed to increase an hourly rate with a client for over 7 years. Yet, it's not as though we have tried and failed, it's we haven't even tried. And that to me is a sad comment. But because of that, we start behaving in a way that isn't very good either. We also have many cost plus deals still in place. And as the clients show up and say, well, you need to figure out how to reduce my total fee by 10% going into next year, we have just systematically over the last 15 years dumbed down the level of seniority in order to deliver a lower cost solution for our client. We also have situations where we're accepting client pressure to reduce our hourly rate. So if we're charging out somebody $100 an hour and the client says, you must reduce your rates by 10, 20%, many of us just sort of roll over and go, well, okay then. We'll do that because we risk losing the business, so we don't want to lose it. The other thing that's classic, and I think probably most of you felt this, which is we go out and scope a piece of work, so maybe it's a $100,000 project or a $1 million body of work, and the client says, well, that's lovely, but I only have 2/3 of that amount. So then what we magically do is we take every assumption that we had in our original staffing plan or whatever we were using for resourcing, and we back it off by 1/3 to get to the client's number, right, just to hit the number. But then we're startled when 6 months has gone by and somehow we've overworked the fee because what we did was we dropped the fee without actually changing the scope. Yet we somehow managed to convince ourselves that what was originally going to take 100 hours will actually take us 70 hours, and we're stunned and surprised when it actually takes 100 hours because we weren't smart enough to go back and rethink everything we were doing. The other thing we're doing is far too often we have clients who are on the aggressive side. We're an industry of very nice people. We're not very good at dealing with procurement people and so on, those that are aggressive. And so when they say, well, that's my number, take it or leave it, all too often that's exactly what we're doing is we're taking it. And then we get into the habit of saying, well, we'll do this for zero profit, or, well, my actual overhead rate might be 100%, or my actual hourly rate might be $100 an hour. Yes, I'll discount it, I'll give it to you for less. And lo and behold, we end up with a margin problem, and frankly, we end up with a service problem. So what we see happening in many of our own agencies is that, first of all, we're running our business on a lower base margin than we've had before. Because we're now struggling to keep basic economics running in our agencies, we will sell in a team with senior people. And so the client gets excited because they get to meet Tom or they get to meet Ann, and they will be the people leading the business. And then lo and behold, Tom and Ann never show up. Or they show up for the occasional meeting. And the clients are they're telling us, it's like, no, you're sort of doing a bait and switch type of approach on us, and it's not making us like you a lot more. I think in some of our agencies where the challenge for margin, if there's a person that leaves a business, it's taking us 2-3 months to replace that person, when in fact we ought to be replacing that person in 2 or 3 weeks. So we're behaving badly. There just doesn't seem to be enough senior people around to drive the work the way that we should be driving it. And because the client has pushed the price down, we're delivering the work with far fewer senior people. And then a comment that came from one of our clients a couple of years ago, because they were getting a little bit angry about about how every time we showed up, all we wanted to do was talk about money. And that is a problem. We really should not be in that business. But we are under so much pressure that it seems like every single time the client changes the scope just a bit, we're having yet again another money conversation. And we had a client said to me, you know, it's as if you're a hot dog stand that's now charging for the mustard and the ketchup that you're putting on the bun. And what's that?
Guac is extra.
Guac is extra, yeah. It'd be nice if we had some guac. So when we talk about pricing, I want to make a very clear distinction, because in our industry we've had a habit of talking about cost when in fact we should be talking about price. So many of you in the room will recognize these sort of attributes, and that is, we often talk internally about billable hours. We talk about our profit level, we talk about our costs, we talk about our utilization of people, we talk about our overhead rates. And because that's our internal conversation, we have a very hard time changing our internal conversation for what we say to clients. So we may talk about this as sort of capable business managers, but we don't know when to stop talking about our costs. And before you know it, we're actually now having a cost conversation with a client rather than a price conversation. So when we try to look at pricing versus costs, these are the cost attributes. Let's talk about the price attributes. And you'll recognize some of these, but you know, it could be, well, what's your agency specialization? What sort of demand is there for your services? What's the culture of your agency? What's your leadership philosophy? How do you manage people? How do you bring people, talent in, and so on? Do you have specific ways of delivering your products to clients? Do you have specific tools that you use to bring to clients? These are things that actually drive the conversation around pricing. Now, what's interesting is we can talk about costs very well. We're very, very skilled at that. But when we get at this list, we sort of look at it going, oh, I don't really know how to have that conversation. Now, I bet there's a few people that recognize what that list really is. Anybody here do new business? Probably a few of you. So what kind of questions are on every single RFP that you get? They're questions like that. And we probably go and say, oh, I have a pat answer that's in the drawer from the RFP that I did last year. Let's pull that out and just paste in the answer under our specialization, our culture values, our leadership, and so on. But what's interesting is that what's happening when we get an RFP is we're being asked by our clients to talk about the things that they might value. And we do it in a somewhat sort of rudimentary way. We don't spend nearly enough time talking about it. So when we talk about price attributes, these are also things that you might say are actually the RFP attributes. These are the things that clients are looking for. They're looking for ways of having you describe how you differentiate yourself from other clients. So I bring this slide up because I want to make sure that we get one fundamental thing clear as we talk about pricing through the rest of the day, which is pricing is absolutely not the same as costing. Now, there's a bunch of you in the room who probably have finance in your title. Right? I recognize many of you. I'm going to insult you, and I apologize. And I'm also going to paraphrase Oscar Wilde. What is an accountant? A person who knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing. He actually said, what's the definition of a cynic? And a cynic is one that knows the cost of everything and the value of nothing. Part of the challenge that we face as an industry is we have delegated the responsibility of pricing and pricing strategy to the finance department. Now, just think a little bit about other industries that you know, whether it's, well, might be, you know, a clothing company or a technology company or a coffee company. Do you think their pricing is dictated by their finance people? You know, if you think about the stories of when the iPhone was launched now 10 years ago, you know, Steve Jobs at the time was quoted as saying the most difficult aspect of launching the iPhone was setting the price. And it wasn't the finance people in the room saying, you know, this is what your price ought to be. It was, what will the market bear? What can I get away with? You know, at what point is the price too high that nobody's going to buy it? At what point is the price too low that actually I'm going to suffer from a margin standpoint and probably devalue the product? We don't tend to have pricing as a discipline within our agencies. And what we've done, because we're an industry that grew up on commissions, certainly for general advertising and media people, we didn't have to worry about pricing back in the days of commission. I'm showing my age here. Then we kind of immediately moved over to cost plus deals for most of the industry. Well, we didn't have to talk about pricing then either because we were just selling, we were selling bodies, and we're selling percentage at a time. So over the years, we become, we've totally forgotten about the need to talk about pricing. And what that means is that as we end up with a conversation with a client about a fee proposal, our dialogue tends to evolve from those cost attributes that I showed you, and we end up in front of a client, and what do we talk about? We talk about hours mostly. And of course, we end up having this discussion where what we'd like is more hours. Well, what does the client want? They'd like less hours. And too many of our conversations are focused on this thing called hours. And the other interesting thing is we believe when we're having a discussion with a client about, well, why does that take you 1,000 hours and can't you do that for, half that and so on, and you must be inefficient, you must not run your business well, because we've started the conversation. This is not the client who has said, that we must talk about hours and nothing else. It's all we've presented to them. And the other thing is, if you were talking to somebody who's really skilled at negotiation, they would never call this a negotiation. They would call this a haggle. A negotiation means that you're actually trading multiple variables in order to get a deal done. But all too often, we're either having a haggle over, how many FTEs, how many creative people, how many media planners, how many whatever, which each of those are sort of individual haggles. And so we're not really even negotiating very well. Now, here's a little bit of a controversial thought I have, and I just want to be clear, which is we're going to talk about pricing. We're not talking about changing the entire dynamic of our industry. I'm just talking about an evolutionary step to become a little bit better at what we're doing. Ron Baker wrote a book several years ago, For the Future, and this is a quote that I liked. And it's not to say that we have to ignore it, but what I'm trying to do is to set this up to say we need to balance our conversations. We need to find a way not to just talk about hours and costs and FTEs and so on, but to evolve that conversation into something greater. We tend to, so for those of you in the room, how many of you tend to work primarily on either hourly rates or cost plus with your clients? All right, so the big show of hands in the back. So tell me, for those of you, who's in the room that does not use anything that looks like hours or cost plus or resource-based plans in their business? Any hands up? Okay, and the only reason I'm asking is I want to make sure I'm not being too focused on my discussions. So here's another thought about that. So if we're dealing with how many hours will it take to get the work done, and therefore what should the fee be? Let me pose something to you. Do you recognize Karl Marx? So Karl Marx was considered to be one of the great economists of the 19th century. He was also one of the fathers of communism. And he said something that you may recognize, and he said the following. He said, a commodity has value because it is crystallized in social labor. The greatness of its value or its relative value depends on the greater or less amount of that social substance contained in it. In other words, the mass of labor that's used to create something. That is one of the that's sort of the foundational manifesto of communism, which is everything is based on how much time is spent to deliver on the product, whether that's I'm making mattresses this year or I'm making tables this year, if you remember the old jokes about the Soviet Union. So the question is, it seems like we're in an industry where actually we're following the communist manifesto. Sell time is what's of value, and it's only time that matters, and it's only resources that matter. We need to find a way to do something slightly better. And the problem we have as an industry is that since we're talking only about time, and we're talking about labor costs, we end up in a situation, and especially in these days, when we're really being pushed to lower our fees. So of course, when the fee is cut, the only lever that you have left is to cut your labor costs. And if you look at your agency metrics, it's probably similar to ours, which is about 70% of your total expense pool is in the staff cost arena. So what's happening is that over the last 10 plus years, we have been cutting and cutting and cutting, as I think the British call it, slicing the salami, to the point that there'll be no salami left. And we have essentially driven ourselves to the point where we are now becoming an industry of small peanuts. The last thing that's left in the Russian doll is this very, very small junior person doing the work, because that's how we've decided that we should manage ourselves in an environment of cost control and cost pushing. Just a small story on the side here. The 4As has been doing a salary survey for decades. Many of you participate in their annual survey. 2 years ago, we looked at the results of the annual survey, and actually Tom Phelan, who's since retired, he and I look back 5 years and then 10 years, and I asked Tom to look back 20 years. Say, what's happened to annual salaries over 20 years in our industry? We found 13 titles that were consistent from 2 years ago versus 20 years ago, 22 years ago. And for those 13 titles, and they're the ones you'd expect, creative director, media planner, account person, broadcast, it was all a pretty familiar list of titles. What we realized was that over 20 years, none of those titles had kept up with inflation. And in fact, the best we found was that creative director and media director managed to exceed 50% of inflation. So essentially, most of those titles are paid today versus 20 years ago at certainly a lower effective annual salary than it was 20 years ago. So what we've essentially done is we have, somewhat unknowingly, because we've done it over time, is just essentially pay less to people. And I think we've all been managing things like title inflation. An account director 20 years ago might have had to be on the job for 10 years. Maybe now it's 5 years. I don't know exactly. It changes agency by agency. So we've been doing this to ourselves, but we're doing it very slowly, and I don't think we've really noticed what's happened over that much time. The clients, of course, are interested in buying things from us, and this curve, if you look on where are you facing? On the left-hand side, these are things that you probably see within a creative agency. On the right-hand side, things that are more likely to be in a media agency or a more data-driven agency. The clients value those things that are at the top of the curve. The clients value things like insights, optimization, they value strategy, analytics, concepts, and so on. They value production less, they value the overall function of execution much less. And we've been seeing this, of course, over the last 5+ years with decoupling of production. Because the clients are saying, I think I can get that stuff cheaper. And so they have. But what's really been happening over our lifetime as an industry is here's how we've been charging. Our fees and ultimately our industry has been driven on the basis of our revenue coming in through execution. And what we've been doing is we've been so thrilled to get large amounts of execution that we've essentially been giving away those things that the client value most. Because our business has been driven on the basis of volume of people, and if I have a lot more junior people, I have a lot more production people, executional people, and that's where I can earn a lot of money. But we haven't figured out how to charge for a great idea, a great concept, great insights. We haven't figured out how to really profit if you're in the media business from, boy, I've just saved the client $10 million, and what did I get for that? Well, I probably got the benefit of maintaining them as a client. But I put $10 million on their bottom line and put a nickel and a half on mine. We haven't figured out how to really benefit from all that. We have to find a way to change this, and we're not going to flip this so-called smile upside down, but we do need to find a way to balance it, and that balancing may look something more like this, which is execution being less. It's still going to be there, regardless of how much is decoupled, but we need to change the overall structure of our compensation to clients. In order to do that, it's going to take a leadership challenge to do that. We need to make sure that pricing is front of mind with our chief execs, front of mind with our office heads, our new business people, and so on. We need to make sure that we aren't just delegating down the responsibility of pricing to the lowest possible person that we can find that owns a spreadsheet, which is what we tend to do today. We also have to find a way that if you think about the decline of the population of the people in our business, we have to figure out how we actually make them better. And this is a Rockefeller quote that I thought was very good. Good leadership consists of showing average people how to do the work of superior people. Now, we're in a bit of a problem right now because what most of our agencies do is they take our most expensive and our most senior people and say, look, I need to get you out of this office, and I need you 100% billable to the client, because that's how I'm going to make money. In fact, our cost plus deals are killing us because we recover so much more overhead on our most senior people, and we therefore make our margins on our most senior people, that what we've done is we've moved to a place where our senior people are almost not engaged with the junior people. And really what we need to be doing right now is saying, you know what, we've been hiring more and more junior people over time. Our senior people have to be the ones that make those junior people better, because the clients will value that. If we just allow people to come into the industry and give them very limited training and get them going, then frankly we're not doing enough to give value back to our client. So it's about finding a way to raise up the quality of our junior people so that we can actually turn this into a much more profitable business. This was a quote made by the founder of Revlon, Charles Revson. I just think it's a very interesting way of thinking about value. In the factories we make cosmetics, in the store we sell hope. In other words, what we do internally does not necessarily equate to what we sell to our clients. Again, this is a reinforcing the concept of cost does not necessarily equal price, and we need to think of different ways to price ourselves. There's a fellow who's a pricing expert. He's written a number of books on pricing. His name's Alan Weiss. Well worth reading some of his work. But here's a quote that I think is perfect, which is, "You'll never be paid more than you think you are worth." Now, this is absolutely true when it comes to negotiating with clients. If the client says, well, we don't think that we should ever be paying a creative director more than $200 an hour. If we don't actually believe that our creative director is worth $300 to $400 an hour, you're never going to get it. And by the way, this concept of you'll never be paid more than you think you're worth is as true to you personally as it is to us professionally. So the next time you go to negotiate your own raise, what are you worth? And if you actually don't believe in yourself, you don't believe in what you deliver to the company, what you deliver to your clients, you're not going to be paid more. The other problem we have is that we tend to be, again, we're going back to the concept of looking at everything through a cost lens. It means that we're always looking internally. Here's an interesting little story about what Chrysler did, selling something called the Chrysler 300, and this goes back a couple of years ago. Does anybody own a Chrysler 300 or a 300C? So the 300C has one difference, and that is the 300C has something called a Hemi engine. And so anybody a car expert here? So a hemispherical engine means that the cylinder, rather than it being a flat cylinder head, it has a curved cylinder head, hemispherical, Hemi. And the actual construction of that engine probably had some original design issues, and it probably has a small cost increase to build that cylinder head rather than the one that they're selling. But what did Chrysler do? The cost of Chrysler, more or less the same. The cost to us, the consumer, they added about $6,000. They actually added 18% to the price of that vehicle because they said, you know what? People value this thing called the Hemi engine. We can price that differently. So they looked at this relative to what the customer wanted rather than what it cost them. Because frankly, if they'd allowed this to be a costing exercise, the 300C would have probably rolled out the door at just slightly more than the 300. You can decide what cylinder head you want on it. So the message here is that we all collectively have to do more thinking about what does the world look like through our clients' eyes. So think of yourself as a buyer rather than as a seller. How would the client view this? The other thing that we do a lousy job on, you remember the chart that I put up originally, it said that we have deals in place where we have not raised the price for 3 years. And in fact, I didn't write it down, but embarrassingly in our case, we found some that are 7 years or more. We failed to manage price increases. And I think the reason we fail to manage price increases is we assume that a price increase has to be 10% or 5%. Otherwise, why bother? This fellow, Rafi Mohammed, wrote a very easy and actually a terrific book called The 1% Windfall. And his premise is that if you increase your price by 1%, you will do more for your business than any other thing that you can do in the way of cost cutting, say at 1% at a time. And here, this is pretty much industry data, but if we said, gee, as finance people, we're going to go out and we're going to reduce our fixed costs. So that's probably our establishment costs, maybe our leases, equipment costs in the business. If we go and reduce that by 1%, we'll probably improve our bottom line by about 3%. All right, that's an interesting ratio, a 1 to 3. Go do some work and you'll put 3 points down on the bottom line. If we can then improve our variable costs, so that's things like staff costs, freelance, maybe new business in some cases, although that's probably not a good place to cut, then, guess what? I can get 4% out of that. If I go and say, well, let's have a look at volume, right, which is, just go win new business at the same price that you had before. Well, that's a pretty good thing. You can probably put 7% on the bottom line. So what happens if your business doesn't grow and if you can't actually just cut costs continuously, because you cannot? So if you say, look, all I need to do is go from $100 an hour to $101 an hour, right? You'd probably go, I'm not getting out of bed for that, right? That just doesn't sound worthwhile. Chances are that's going to put about 11% on your bottom line. So exactly the same work with the same cost base for 1% more. So this is referred to as the 1% windfall. What we fail to do is when we pitch business and we win business, we fail to say, hey, what's our plan for year 2 and beyond? What are we going to do to increase? And we think, it's probably not worth going to the client just asking for 1%. But actually, if you went to the client and said, you know what, I'm here to ask for 5%, and the best you can do is 1%, you have absolutely won. In fact, the story I say to people is if you go out and ask for 5%, you get 0, you have also won, because next year it's going to be even harder for them to say no. But many of us fail to even put on our boots, if you will, and go out and ask. I just want to extend this concept of the price increase. This is something that comes from a Harvard study called Principles of Pricing. And what they said, and this was about 1% price increases, if they did not negatively impact demand, hopefully, it would lead to increases in the net income, the profit, of Fuji by 16.5%, Nestle 17.5%, 26% for Ford. In fact, an average price increase of 1% would boost the net income of the typical large corporation by about 12%. And as they say, thus, getting the pricing right is indeed a big deal. And what do? We delegate it to the most junior person in the department that has a spreadsheet. All right, so we don't spend nearly enough time on this. The other thing that we have to keep in mind is that I think we're an industry of really nice people. We generally are. We're good people to work with. We believe everybody's honest, and for the most part they are. From a pricing standpoint, our clients are real professionals at pricing. You know that if you've gone online recently to try to buy an airline ticket, it bounces all over the place. There's some amazing algorithm going on about the pricing for airline tickets. If you go and look for a hotel room, same sort of thing. The prices just bounce all over the place. We had an intern work for us one summer who then got a job working for American Airlines. He was an MBA. And his entire job was to run one route. That was his job at American Airlines, so just to run the route. I think it was from New York to St. Louis or something. And that person spent all their time trying to figure out how to maximize the revenue on an airplane because that was important to them. Figuring out how to leverage pricing when decisions were made, when tickets were booked, and so on was a big deal. I talked about Apple earlier, but every single industry, except I think ours, takes pricing in a very, very serious way. By the way, how many people here belong to something like a pricing institute? Brett would, which is good. But you know what's great about Brett? Brett's come from outside of our industry, into our industry, and therefore is one of the few people that has actually figured some of this stuff out. So the other thing we know about clients is that they're professional buyers. I'm sure everybody in the room has dealt with procurement at one point or another. And here's what we look like. We look like some goofy group wearing a pair of toy wings where our clients are flying in their G5s or G6s or whatever it might be. And what we know about us as amateur sellers is there's a number of attributes that are so predictable, and I think our clients see us coming. If you're an amateur seller, chances are you're very vulnerable, and here's why. First of all, we fail to establish any kind of value conversation up front. And when I say value, I'm not talking about, we need to be able to sell ourselves based on the output or the outcome of the business. I'm talking about just why are we there and what are we doing and what's the client going to gain by having us there. So we tend to go into our discussions talking about our staffing and our hours and our fees rather than what's the benefit of us doing this work for the client. We always focus on defending our costs rather than proving why our costs are valuable to the client. We tend to make the mistake of believing that every time we get an email or a call from procurement saying you must drop your pricing, we assume that every one of those requests are genuine and real, which they're absolutely not. Brett? So Brett's a reformed procurement person, right? And Brett would say, the number of times I call people trying it on, and the old adage of clients call and say, you've got to drop your price by 20%. They'd be thrilled if they got 2, 3, they'd be over the moon if they got anything.
Well, let me ask a quick question
Yeah.
if I can. How many of us have actually lost a piece of business for saying no to procurement? Walk away because it's not the right piece of business,
Yep.
but lost a piece of business for saying no to procurement.
I would say rarely.
not one person raises their hand. It's
Yeah.
the same thing within my network as well. When you say no, it paralyzes them.
Yeah, they have nowhere to go because they're not used to anybody in our industry saying no. So the other thing we tend to do is, remember earlier I said client said, I've got $80,000 for your $100,000 bid. And what we do is we go, what? I'll take your $80,000, and we don't change the scope. So we've essentially taught the client that our number must have been wrong to begin with. If we're able to do it for 20% less, and we do all the work we said we're going to do, even though we know we're going to struggle, the client's actually been taught that our number must have been complete baloney. And here's the last one. This one's really important, and Brett already mentioned this, which is, if we're amateur at this, it usually signals that we're unwilling to walk away. We had a great presentation from somebody, a senior partner at McKinsey years ago, and he said, if you're unwilling to walk away, then you are begging. And if you're begging, you look desperate. And if you look desperate, you're not a very attractive partner. Now, I've mentioned that professionally, but think about that personally. So if you're not willing to walk away, all of a sudden you start looking like a potential agency that the client goes, they may not be that good. They just seem desperate. I can smell it. And so this is one of the reasons why we need to change our thinking and change our culture of how we manage these things. So what does that mean? That means ultimately that our pricing and ultimately our selling skills don't come anywhere close to the professional buyers that we're dealing with every single day of our life. And we allow that to carry on. I mean, this is a struggle we face inside of my own company, which is, we will not spend the time to train people to become better at selling and better at negotiating. And it seems that everybody's worried about pricing themselves too high. So here's my friend Alan Weiss again, and there's two things that he says, and this seems to be a shock to some of our client-facing people. There's nothing intrinsically unethical, illogical, or impractical or illegal about trying to maximize the fees that you charge to your clients. If you raise your fees beyond the value that clients perceive in the relationship, the market forces will ultimately drive them away. So if you are in a habit of overcharging and the clients don't think it's valuable, it'll start showing up and you will end up being pushed down. But here's what he also says. He says, conversely, if the clients perceive even more value for your services than you're charging, there will be no reciprocal pressure from them to drive the fees up. So in other words, your job is to control that dynamic. If you don't try to push the price up, no one else is going to do it for you. And there's nothing wrong with trying to maximize the price that you can get for your services. The problem is we allow the market to just keep pushing us down, pushing us down, pushing us down. And there's really nothing that's trying to pull it up. So we are destined for the lowest pricing possible. So a couple of final thoughts on this, and we'll move into something a little bit more practical. I believe firmly that pricing is ultimately a mixture of art and science. I have two kids in college right now, one that's got their way out, because I follow their classes. And I'm reminded that to go through a curriculum like calculus, remember that? That was fun. It takes a lot of hours, right? But back when we were all students, we accepted the fact that learning a new skill took an awful lot of time and took a lot of effort, and you had to study and you had to keep reworking it. And if you didn't, you failed. But somehow, we're now, wearing our big boy pants, as they say, and somehow we believe that, we'll sit through one session, one presentation, I'll read a memo, and apparently we're all supposed to be geniuses. It doesn't happen. So we have to keep in mind that pricing is something that requires a hell of a lot more than just, listening to me on a day like today. And let me just ask you a question. And I'm going to ask a little bit of a show of hands. Who in your business today is managing the pricing strategy of your business? So just show of hands. Who would say their new business department is managing pricing strategy? Okay, one in the back. How about who would say the CEO and the client or client service director of your agency is managing the pricing? Okay, that's not bad. Okay, who would say that it's actually the CFO or the finance department that's managing pricing? Okay, so I would say that's half the room is saying it's CFO. What about, how many people would say actually it's the client that's dictating the pricing to you? Yeah, that's sad too. So the reality is that we should see the full show of hands at number 2. This is a leadership issue. Pricing should be set by heads of offices, CEOs, whatever you want to call them. Yet, I think what we saw in there was maybe 10% of the room saying that's really where it's coming from. And I would implore you to look at your own business and develop a pricing strategy for your office. And there's no such thing as developing a pricing strategy for the world, because the world differs, in different locations. The needs are different. We have we're not going to go through this, but this is, this happens to be our sort of 6-step process. It's okay. Some of our offices have done it. The ones that have would say it's been a really healthy exercise. There's another thing that you can do, and this is a process that Tim Williams from the Ignition Consulting Group set up. And I, by the way, I'm a big fan of Tim Williams. He's done an awful lot for our organization, but he believes firmly in this concept of creating a pricing council. And the view is, and this is really Tim's view, which is the pricing council of an office. And please don't get me wrong, pricing councils of a global team makes no sense. Pricing tends to happen office by office, other than for a few big global deals. It should include the office head, a client service director, probably a department head. Chances are your strategy group, if you have such a thing in your office, are probably some of the best people to help you manage your pricing. Includes also new business development. And I put here, and actually I think Tim started this, which is finance is there, of course, but it's not leading. But the whole idea is to establish the pricing council, publish a strategy, make sure everybody that is involved in selling to clients understand how you're pricing yourself. You'll see as we go through the practical exercises later on that this is really all about making life easier, creating templates for proposals and so on, and ultimately making sure that you're practicing what you put in place. So I'm going to wrap up there, and then we're going to move on to the next section. I want you to just remember one thing, and that's this, which is, this is not about cost, even though that's what we're most comfortable with. It's ultimately about price. So, take a breather. That's my soapbox, and we'll move on to some practical things. So that was all really nice theory, and some of you go, well, there's probably some things there that were interesting, but the whole thing for the next section is to really get into some practical ways that you can start improving how you're presenting your proposals to clients. Now, I mentioned earlier that when we do this internally, we might have a room full of 20 people, and they'll be sitting at tables, and we'll have them do breakout groups and so on. And the reason we do that is we want to make sure that they're testing out these ideas and actually using them on the spot, and they'll become clear to you a little bit later why that's the case. In the folder, you'll see a few of these things that we'll go through very quickly in this group, because this is not a great forum for breakout groups, and most people cringe when they hear breakout groups, and I didn't want to torture you with that. Just keep something in mind, and I think I learned this the very hard way, which is if you just sit here and listen to me, chances are you're not going to retain much. In fact, this guy, Edgar Dale, wrote about the cone of experience, and he said 10% of what we read is what we retain. We'll only retain 20% of what we hear. But interestingly enough, when you get down to the bottom of this list, we'll retain 70% of what we say and what we write, and we'll retain 90% of what we actually say and participate in. So involvement in any kind of training is critical. In fact, I would say one of the things that I've been guilty of is we've been doing far too much telling in our industry. In other words, I bet everybody in this room has some sort of deck on something operational in your business, whether it's finance, and you go, I have my training deck, and I show up and I see my new account executives, and I give them this, once a month I run through this training deck. We've made this mistake of assuming that by telling people, we're actually training them. And this is a quote that actually is more often attributed to Ben Franklin, but it's tell me and I forget, teach me and I may remember, involve me and I may learn. So I say this, and then I'm going to apologize, because I'm not going to involve you as much as I'd like to. And so as we go through the exercises for the rest of the afternoon, these are in your blue folder. I may get you to turn around and talk to somebody behind you just to share a few notes. But you'll get a sense of this, which is it's all about getting involved so that you learn a few new things. So again, hopefully you can engage with the content. The goal here is to make us all a little bit better. But really what I want you to do out of today is to say, how can I take this stuff? By the way, make it your own. I mean, this is something that we developed over the last few years. Again, Tim Williams was a big part of getting us to this point. And so we've been doing some of these presentations ourselves without Tim, but we still use him in a very, very big way. So let's talk a little bit about my favorite topic of things like timesheets and where we go. So a little bit of true or false. Would you say that productivity is measured in billable hours? What's that, Ann? Is that you see that? Ann's giggling. Measured in billable hours, true or false?
Trick question.
It is a trick question. I mean, we tend to behave like, everybody behaves right now that we measure productivity in billable hours. So we would instinctively say, well, yeah, that's how we behave, so yes. So do we then say the best way to measure productivity is using billable hours? Again, this is where we have our clients show up and say, you're not efficient. You're not efficient. You must be inefficient, which is why you're charging me too much. We sure can't really measure productivity in billable hours. We can talk about how much time is spent, but that's not a productivity discussion. We of course manage our business using billable hours for the most part. I mean, some of you raised your hand and said you don't use billable hours, but you probably use some sort of resource dynamic for your billing to clients. Would you say that intellectual capital can be measured in billable hours? Probably not. Here's one of my favorites. An exceptional solution can cost the same as a poor solution. Sadly, yes. Our business, I'll charge $100,000 whether it's great or whether it's crap. And that's not to say that we should shift everything over, but we should recognize what we bring to our clients and recognize the value that we bring. And then, of course, we would know that an exceptional solution has nowhere near the same value as a poor solution when it's ultimately out the door. I talked about price and cost. And one of the things that we've learned is that just making a very simple change internally to our language can have a big difference in the way that we behave with clients. You may remember at the beginning I said, well, we tend to talk about billable hours and cost per hours and so on. And we don't know how to stop talking about that when we leave the office. We say the same things to the client. Our brain can only handle so many words. But what we know is we will not change the way we behave until we change the language that we use. So this is a very, very simple exercise that we go through. If you could pull out the blue folder, I'll show you what I'm talking about. There should be in there, let's get my wand. There should be a piece of paper that says changing our language. Should be. There it is. Looks like that. So just have a look at this. You can pull out a pen, but I think you're going to find that this is real 101 stuff. So we're not going to spend more than a few minutes on this. But what we do is we talk to our teams and say, right, these are the words we use today, the ones down the left-hand side. What are alternative words that you could use when you're talking to your client about proposals that you're making? So what we typically do is say, look, work with your group and come up with a different set of words that work. Do you want to try to do that just together? You want to throw out some options? So what do you think we should use instead of the word cost when we're talking to clients about our proposals? It's not a trick question. Okay, what else? Investment, what you said, resource? Yep. Yep. Price? Price is the answer I'm looking for. Not to lead the listeners. Do you remember a couple of times I showed you that cost does not equal price? Yep. But in lieu of, so I'll tell you something that we did, which was with the small group of people that I work with, we said let's at least, with our small crowd, almost use cost like it's a swear jar. Let's talk about price every time we talk. You get dinged if you use the word cost. It's amazing the impact that has to the attitude, which is all of a sudden I'm talking price and I'm not talking cost, and it's I haven't changed anything yet, other than a small change in attitude. So what about the next one? If you're sending a client an estimate, what's a different word you could use than estimate to the client? In my mind, an estimate sounds like something you're going to get from the car repair shop. When you ding your car, you go to the auto body shop. They will give you an estimate of how much it will cost to do that. I think a proposal is a great word. It gets a little more challenging when you look at things like hours and hourly rates, but does anybody have a better word for hours or rates or billable time? Outputs is an interesting one. You can talk about resources. In fact, I think resources works. You know, when the client wants to know what resources are bringing in the business, we can do that. How about down at the bottom, efficiency? What's a better word than efficiency? Yeah, so effectiveness is a great word. So, you know, because we do, again, the procurement word is, you know, you must be inefficient. You know, it's just a damning claim that you just can't refute. But we need to talk more about effectiveness rather than just efficiency. There's a number of other things on the back page of that, but they are much of the same, which is you might work with a group to say, you know, we don't present an estimate to a client, we present a proposal. What would you say when the client says, how much will this cost? Our reply might be, the price to do this is. I know this is simple, this is really cheap, it's simple stuff. How much time of staff will this take? My favorite is, it'll take as much time as it needs to give you what you want. In other words, stop you worrying about my hours, I'll get the work done for the price we've agreed. When the client asks, why are you spending so many hours on this? Again, our response should be, we're spending just what's needed to get this done according to your brief. And we can't wait to answer a question. So when a client sends an email or gets on the phone going, why are you spending so many hours? Well, we're like, it's like, oh my God, I better answer the question. Or in fact, maybe you should find a different way to answer some of these questions. When the client looks around the room and counts the number of people and says, wow, this is an expensive meeting, you know, the answer is we have only brought the people that are necessary to get this work done. But again, our attitude is that when we get a threatening question like that, we immediately sort of turn around, whimper a little bit and go, oh, we'll bring as many next time. So when an RFP asks for a detailed breakdown of your costs, a good way to rephrase your response might be along the lines of, we provided a pricing proposal that meets the brief that you've given us. The way that we deliver our services is based on price and so on. But these are the sort of questions that you should practice internally. So when we talk about a pricing council, it sounds like a really grand thing. In some cases, the pricing council's job is just to get the language right, just to make sure that the firm itself, the agency, starts using the right words when they're talking to clients. So we're talking about behavioral change, and again, imagine we've just had a big breakout group. I involved you. You've all written things down. You all wrote the wrong things down. We corrected you, right? This is how we're going to get out of here quicker than 6 o'clock. But here's the thing. Everybody thinks, well, Rick came up, told us that we should stop using the word cost, and now it's price. I'm all done. Let's go play golf, right? And what we've learned is it takes an awful lot of effort to change attitudes, to change behavior. So we look for an expert to tell us about, you know, what it takes to unlearn one behavior and put in a new one. And you'd think we'd go to Harvard or MIT. Well, what we did was we actually found a rocket scientist down in Alabama to tell us a little bit about how to make changes. Here, have a watch. So a couple of things I wanted you to get at that. One is change is hard. It takes an awful lot of practice. Telling is not training, which is one of the things that we do way too often. And that if you're going to make a change in your organization, it's something that has to be done over and over and over again. Otherwise, it won't stick. So we want to talk about a concept called outcomes, outputs, and inputs. And as I said before we had the break, we're building here. We're building on changing our language. So here's yet another change to our language, and we're going to wrap this all up in the last section. So we've got two specific things we're going to talk about now before we finish the day. So this is all about describing, you know, the way our business runs using 3 simple words. And so we might refer to our people as inputs, but they're not the only inputs. Inputs might also involve things like data, research information, and so on. But what we tend to manage these days, as we spoke earlier, many of our deals these days are input-based deals, and how we sell ourselves. But what we create for our clients, we can call outputs, and then ultimately how the clients benefit from them, we can call outcomes. Some people also call it impact. In other words, you know, what did you deliver, and how did that change the outcome of, say, the marketing program? Here's an example of how to think about inputs outputs and outcomes in a sort of a real world environment. So for those of you that own a house and you have to worry about keeping your grass cut, here are 3 different companies that might come and offer you services to manage your lawn. And so the yard care company A is an input company, and they will come and do anything that you want them to do, and they will charge you $50 an hour. So whether it's trimming your hedges, cutting your grass, fertilizing your lawn, cleaning out your gutters, $50 an hour, that's their rack rate. Blended rate, anything you want, $50 an hour. So they're an input-based company. Yard care company B has a price list, and they have a set price for every time that they come and mow your lawn. That'll be $40. Every time that they come and trim your hedges, well, that's a certain price. Every time they come and fertilize, that's another certain price. They have a menu, if you will, of prices, and so we'd refer to them as an output company. And then yard care company C is the one that says, you're really busy. You pay me X, maybe it's $250 a month. Every night when you come home from work, your lawn will be perfectly manicured, your hedges will be perfectly trimmed. Don't you worry about even calling me to clean the gutters. I just do that naturally. You'll see me show up in the fall and I'm going to clean things up, and in the spring I'm going to get your yard completely ready, and for $250 a month we're done. So they are an outcome-based company, which is fixed price for a deliverable, or fixed price for a lawn, sort of beautiful, well manicured lawn. So we break the concept of outcomes, outputs, and inputs into this simple thing, which is a lot of inputs are used to drive the things that we produce for the client. I had to put a triangle slide in. And ultimately, this is all about driving some result for the client. And so the question we have is, well, how do we think about these words relative to our industry and our business? Is there a way that we could start categorizing those things that we do in a way? So here's an example of, just want to make sure I've got the right slide up here. If you were a digital agency, a creative agency, maybe a media agency, these are the sort of things that you'd have. The inputs column is actually very, very straightforward. And then for inputs, you recognize that it might be some external data, whether that's customer data, scanner data, might be access to web services these days in digital, but ultimately it's mostly the time of staff that we enumerate for our inputs. And then for the outputs, just have a look at it. Hopefully you can see these guys. The Jade group in the back, you guys really are willing to move forward. So video campaigns, maybe a launch of a new product, print ads, media buys, package designs, maybe it's digital stuff in the way of landing pages, microsites, and so on. So those would be things that are called outputs. And then the outcomes, and this is the tougher one to manage. Everybody, when I ask them, well, what would be an outcome? What's the client's desire? What are they trying to accomplish? And they'll say, sales, increase sales. It's like, okay, yeah, but that's kind of like, that's down the chain of the desired outcome. Of course, everybody wants increased sales, but there's a step along the way. And those steps along the way may be anything from, increasing customer preference. It might be, if it's a credit card company, it's new card members. It could be card member retention. Anyway, list of what you have here. So our clients show up and say, we need, items 1, 2, and 3, and there's a reason why they're asking for it. Hopefully there's a reason why they're asking for it. And our job is to make sure that we can match the outputs that we're creating with the desired outcomes from their standpoint. I've done this chart for a couple of different sectors of our industry. If you happen to be in the market research business, the list of things may look a little more like this. There's one client that started having us price our services using the concept of inputs, outputs, and outcomes. For those of you that work on Coca-Cola, you might recognize some of their history, which is, they today don't really want to know about the inputs. They will define prices for outputs. I have to watch the O's. And they'll say, I'll pay you $50,000 for the insights phase of this new this new project. I'll pay you another $50,000 for the creative development side, another $50,000 for production. And then what they do, because they're interested in paying us based on outcomes, is I think at the moment they've got a 30% variable piece based on the overall results of that work. So they've sort of started a thing which loosely looks like inputs, outputs, and outcomes. So that was one of the two. So this is the second, and therefore the last that we're going to do. Tom mentioned early on, and I think in the brief, I said this is all about talking about options. And options is something that indeed Tim Williams trained us on 3-4 years ago. And so we have been trying to take the message around to our organization to get people to buy into it. But before we start talking about options, I want to tell you a little bit of story. Little story. You've heard of Goldilocks and the Three Bears. So, just, dig back into your memory the last time you either remember having it read to you or maybe you had the pleasure of reading the story to somebody. So what happens to Goldilocks? Goldilocks is wandering through the woods and comes across a bear cabin, as we all do. And she goes into the cabin. Bears have left. And Goldilocks finds 3 bowls of porridge or oatmeal. And of course Goldilocks tries one, it's too hot, one's too cold, one's just right. She's very happy. She goes and tries chairs and breaks a chair, but then you remember at the end she goes and tries the beds. One's far too hard, one's far too soft, and the other one's just right. And Goldilocks is so happy that she lies down on this bed and she's so content that she falls asleep. And of course, as you know the story, the bears come rushing into their house that they fail to lock, as they do, and they run her out of town. So what do we learn from the Goldilocks story? Because actually Goldilocks could have come across a bear's cabin where there was only one bowl of porridge. And what would she have done? If she was hungry, she probably would have eaten that bowl of porridge. And if there was only one chair, she probably sat in that chair. And if there was one bed, she probably tried it, but she probably didn't fall asleep because she wasn't quite as content as she was when she had the choice of 3. So the little insight we get from Goldilocks and the Three Bears is that choice matters, and that providing options to Goldilocks and your customers actually allows them to be far more involved in the decision making and much more involved in making a choice on the things that matter to them most. Now, this may be surprising to you, of course, but you're actually making choices every single day of the week. Whenever you go and buy anything, you're always making a choice, and you're always given a choice. So if you go out, and let's say tonight you've got a party to go to, and somebody says, oh, bring some bubbly. And you'll sit there going, oh, I gotta bring bubbly. Well, I can go and buy a bottle of Prosecco for about $15. That's pretty adequate stuff. Or you know what, this is a special event because my best friend just got a promotion. I'm gonna go and splurge and I'm gonna bring a bottle of Veuve Clicquot, and that'll cost me, $50, but she's worth it or he's worth it, so I'm gonna bring that. Or, you know what, it's my parents' 25th wedding anniversary or maybe their 50th wedding anniversary, and this is a time to really celebrate. And frankly, I can't tell that there's a huge difference between $200 and the 15, this minor one. But you've gone to the liquor store and you said, you know what, I will make the choice that is important for the task at hand. In other words, celebrating with whoever I'm celebrating with tonight. So you see these things all day long. So if you're out looking for, say, buying a new cell phone or a new cell phone plan, and this comes off of, I can't remember, this might be, Sprint's. So you might be looking for a new phone. Maybe you're looking for your kid who's managed to break the screen on the last 3 that they've owned. And so, no personal stories here. So what do your choice is, I can get a pre-owned Apple 7, that's going to cost me $16.67 a month. Or you know what, I can buy an LG, it's still a smartphone, probably an Android phone, and I can get that for as cheap as $10 a month. Or I can get the iPhone 6S, very reliable phone, and that's going to cost me $12.50 a month. But you can make the choice. And what happens is that when somebody like Sprint sends this up to you on their website, you're involved and you're engaged, and you're immediately saying, what's most important to me? Now, you know what's important to me? Cheap's important. Or, no, in this case, it needs to be an iOS device instead of an Android device. If you're moving your apartment or your house and you have to go and buy yourself a broadband plan, chances are you're given a number of different options. And the price is going to probably matter to you relative to your budget. But you may say, well, you know what? Actually, what I really need is the fastest, most impressive broadband plan I get, and I will pay over $60 a month to get that because that's what matters to me most. But you're involved in the decision-making process. Or you might be out looking for a new car. And when you go to a website like in this case, this is Ford's website to buy a Fiesta, you're immediately involved in the car purchase. In fact, chances are you're going to go to the website, you're going to configure exactly the car that you want and that fits the price that you're willing to pay. And you're engaged with whether you're going to get a hatchback, whether you're going to get a 4-door, 5-door, whether you're going to put a real whizzy sound system in there, whether you're going to have leather seats, whether you're going to have a sunroof. And you've been engaged in the process of buying that Ford Fiesta, in this case, every step of the way. In fact, you know exactly what you want before you even show up in the dealer's lot, because you've been engaged in the process and you've been given an awful lot of choice, just like Goldilocks was. If you're in our business, and perhaps you need to find some stock photos, and this is a sort of my own personal story. When I was, I think, in London at one point, I had to get some stock photos for a presentation that I was giving, and I realized I didn't have any, and it was early in the morning and nobody was awake here. So I went to the iStock photo website, and lo and behold, they gave me a couple of different options. They said, well, I can get you 3 images for the equivalent of about $50. I can get you 25 images for the equivalent of about $180. Or I can give you a monthly plan, and you can either buy that by the month or buy that by the year. A lot more money, but I have a huge number of images available to me. Or I could say, what? Actually, I'm a team of people. We're always having to go online and download things. I can go and get a license for 2 users. I can get up to 750 images a month, and that's going to cost me a reasonably good price. In other words, that's a lot better deal than if I'm having to buy and pay image by image. But what was interesting about this example was I went online and immediately was able to make a decision. Now, if iStock Photo had presented just this to me, or frankly, just any one of the plans, what would have happened? I would have come here and went, well, in this case, I'm not a team and I certainly don't need a license for 2 users, so I'm going to go to a competitor site. I'm going to go look at Getty's website, or I'm going to go somewhere else. But the mere fact that iStock Photo was putting options in front of me, very, very different price points. I was involved in a decision. I could make a decision that suited me. And in fact, I never left this website. I did it right then and there and signed up, as I'm sure they hope everybody does. But they were giving me choices. The other thing that you do, so some of you may be Starbucks addicts, and you know exactly what you're going to get every day. But chances are, if you go to a client's room, you go to their cafeteria, and you're presented with an option of, you want a soda for lunch. What size do you want? Which size are you likely to choose? And this gets into a little bit of behavioral economics and what's happening. Have a watch. Big surprise. And this happens to us all day long. But here's the premise. And the premise here is that there is no such thing as absolute value. There is no way of saying, a 12-ounce cup of coffee is always worth X, or more importantly, a medium cup of coffee is always worth X. And so what we learn is that buyers, and this is true for those of you who are consumers and buying things every day, that you ultimately need context to help you make a decision. In the absence of context, you will struggle. In fact, if you're only given one size of cup of coffee to order, oh yeah, you're probably going to order that, but chances are you're going to go, I don't really need that much, or I need more than that, and you'll be slightly dissatisfied. I know cups of coffee are not the most important thing in our day. There is a behavioral economist, a guy named Dan Ariely, and Dan has written a book which I think is amazing. The book is called Predictably Irrational, and you can imagine in the marketing world, this sort of thinking is what hits us all day long. But the book is called The Hidden Forces That Shape Our Decisions, and he's the one that has coined this phrase, which I think is perfect, which is most people don't know what they want unless they see it in context. Let's have a look at this little video just to drill this point. I just want to show you what the experiment was, just in case you didn't get it. So the top table here shows the original offer, and we had a web only 59, a print only 125, and then web and print 125. And when that set of choices were given to the students, 85% of the people chose the most expensive. Take it at the middle option, and what you'll see is now all of a sudden 2/3 of the people want the cheapest, and about 1/3 of the people want the most expensive. So his point is, very simple and stated again, people don't know what they want unless they see it in context. And it's a really important thing to know as we put together our proposals for clients. So what we've been experimenting over with for the last couple of years is to make sure that when we put together proposals for our clients, we're considering how to give them context. And so here's what we've learned. Oh, actually, I want to ask you this question first before we go there. Here's something that happens. You often get a client who will call, or maybe it's your own your own chief exec, or maybe it's a finance person that says, oh, by the way, we've got to do X. Can you give me a high-low on that? Is that going to be between 20,000 and 40,000? And so I'd ask you to think about something, which is if you're ever asked by a client or by anybody that you ultimately are selling to, should you ever give just 2 numbers? We do it all the time. You know, I could lowball this at 20 and I highball this at 40. You know, that's my estimate. What we know is that when you give 2 options, chances are they're going to go to the low one because they don't have the context for the high one. But if a client came and said, look, I really need a rough estimate of producing this thing, whatever that might be, could you give me an estimate? If we said, you know, on the low end it'll be 20, but actually I think we can get you, you know, a pretty good solution at 30, 35, and then at the high end it's 40. Immediately what's happened when you do that is all of a sudden the client has almost discarded the 20 and is now focusing on the 35. So the next time you're asked for a high-low, you know, you should say, I'm actually never going to give a high-low, I'm going to give 3 options. So here's what we learned, which is when we put together options, it's all about saying, what are the deliverables that we're going to give to a client? So you're going to find very quickly here that I'm going to jump back into inputs, outputs, and outcomes. What are we going to do in the way of delivering the client some level of customization? Maybe things like revisions are things that you can put in front of a client, and ultimately, you know, give them options in terms of timing, how much work they have to do, what sort of access they might have to the talent, and frankly, any other features or benefits that may help the client make a decision. You know, you might also include things like, oh, well, I can give an option that has pre-testing, or I can have an option that gives them some sort of post-analysis, whether that's measurement analytics or otherwise. I might give them something that's about redeploying later another time frame, and so on. A couple of other things that we found. Here's some examples from a company that did a website development project. By the way, this could be one of your companies for all I know. Designing a way of presenting options for your company really helps when you're down to the wire and you have to get something at the door. So in this case, you've got a website company that decided that they would use a nice simple format for developing proposals for the client. And guess what they've done? They've done some things which I would say hit the category of really simple iconography. You know, they've got little clocks in here to represent time. They've got 2 stars in this option, 4 stars in that option. Oh, this has social engagement. This has mobile engagement. Look at these key metrics. Quality goes all the way to full way on each one of these options. Of course, the quality is awesome in all 3 options. You know, then they've got innovation as the next thing. You get a little bit of innovation, you get a lot of innovation. How about mobile? Yeah, a little bit of mobile or a lot of mobile. How much time, and so on. And then they've actually done the outcome statement down here. Why should you do this? Which is really an outcome statement. And then price it. Here's another example, company that does experiential. And again, they've just taken the view that says, you know what, I can come up with a simple format for every proposal I do. I can talk about, you know, the people, the execution, the key measures, the pricing. In this case, they've taken 3 options and then said, oh, I can do some supersizing on this. You know, would you like fries with that? And so they've added a few things that are incremental costs. Obviously, they're not material relative to the big project, but the things that, you know, you can put as an add-on. Yeah, sorry, it's a little bit hard to read from a distance. So my recommendation is that one of the things that your pricing council ought to do is to say, what's our format going to be for presenting our options to clients? And this is my attempt, because I'm a really good art thinking guy. You know, I think I took a PowerPoint chart and did some good. You can do a hell of a lot better than that. But the point is, do something that becomes the standard for how you present your options to the clients. And then we have a couple of best practices. So what do we know? We know that providing 3 options is really important. Don't provide 2, you've already learned that. And you know what? Try not to provide 4, but do some upselling if you think there's a need to do an add-on that sounds like you're trending towards the 4th option. Why is that? Because you don't want to make it complicated. 3 is easy to choose from, 4 starts getting complicated. I believe firmly that the 3rd option should be your highest price. There are some, Tim Williams, for example, believes that your first one ought to be your highest. I don't agree with it. I think that annoys clients. When you start off with your most expensive, they think you're arrogant and so on. Always make sure you're describing the outcomes and then make sure you list the outputs, and then if there's any supporting inputs, obviously list that. What did we learn about coffee cups? Middle option may most likely be the one that's selected, so if you're putting together a middle option, make sure you like it. Right, because if you put a middle option in that actually go, oh my God, I hope they don't choose that one. Assume that you've got to make sure that all your options are things that you buy into. So I've got a couple of things. I think we've already talked about it. It gives you context. It moves the dialogue away from talking about hours and rates to which of these options works best for you. Ultimately helps the buyer decide. You know that now. And it ultimately then means that you as the seller, you're starting to move into becoming a professional seller. And you can start coaching the client and pushing towards things that you know matter to the client that ultimately also matter to you. Ultimately, this is all about just making sure we focus on what matters most rather than diving straight into hours, hourly rates, costs, overhead rates, profit, and so on. So in some ways, we're just trying to add to our toolkit so that we can do better. Thanks, everybody. Thanks for listening. I really appreciate it.